We are delighted to have today Dr. Vas Taras. He is the founder of the X Culture Project. Please welcome Dr. Taras.
Thank you. Thank you. So when it comes to teams in particular, the challenge is that work teams or teams in general, they do not exist in large numbers, in large quantities in the wild, so to speak. So if you wanted to study work groups or any other interactions among employees in organizations, so it is very difficult to find multiple work groups that work on the same things at the same time under the same supervision. It's just simply impossible. So even if you had access to the largest companies, Google, Microsoft, General Motors, they do have thousands of teams, no doubt. But each team works in a different building under a different project, different time frame, different compensation and incentive structure, different manager. And so you can't really compare them. Another big challenge, and this one goes beyond teams, is that in the organizational context, nobody will allow you to conduct experiments and even collecting data, even like just doing surveys, often is not possible beyond maybe one quick survey of attitudes or I don't know, whatever values. The reason for that, again, obviously, is that it will interfere with the work process. And so nobody will allow to manipulate, will not let you manipulate how people are compensated or how long their meetings are or what tools they use for the meetings and things like that. And so X Culture provides at least a partial solution to that problem. So when you look at, for example, at research on teams specifically, almost all of the publications in org behavior journals, you would either have a case study of a corporate team or maybe a couple of teams, or more often it's like 80-90% of all publications, it's a professor at a large Midwestern university, had a class of 50 students, split those students into 10 teams of 5, and they played some sort of a game or activity during a lecture. And so the problem with that approach, obviously, is first, it's still a small number of teams, but also those are students, not employees. The incentives are, well, for a credit or, bonus added to the course grade. So the incentives are not the same. If it's global virtual team, in many cases, the virtuality and globality or a global dimension are simulated. So the students would be then, like you guys in that corner pretend that you're in Asia, and you guys in this corner pretend that you're in North America, or, pretend that you speak online, and sometimes the software introduces some errors or delays to simulate this virtual environment. So it's usually simulated too short to be real. The incentives are not the same. And so often that's the best we can do. Sometimes you can find a study or two where it's like an Indian call center or call center in India where it's like thousands of people and they sort of work in teams, but those are not quite the same interdependent teams that you would see, or that you mean when you talk about work groups. So they kind of work in groups, but it's more like a bunch of individuals who work in the same room and just have some sort of a team structure. So that's a persistent challenge. And as I said, conducting experiments or even frequent surveys often just would not be possible because it just, So X Culture kind of solves that problem. And let me tell you a little bit first about the history of the project, but then about the data, experiments, and things like that we do. So I've been in North Carolina for now almost 18 years. And so when I came here, I was asked to teach international business. And so my challenge was that many of my students didn't have international experience. In fact, many of them haven't really left the state, still, applies today. And so when I tell them that doing business with Ukrainians, for example, or the Germans is different than doing business with the Americans, they wouldn't quite understand what I mean. It's not that they don't believe me, it's like I'm trying to teach them how to swim on a football field, right? You need to get in the water to learn how to swim. I can tell you, a dozen lectures on water. I can invite the best swimmers. I can show you documentaries. We can even play some games and simulations on swimming. But until you get in the water, you will not learn how to swim. So with international business, it's also kind of the same. So you have to have that international experience. And so at that time, I thought the idea would be that I would find a professor in a different country who also teaches international business. And we would put our students in international teams, Americans, for example, and Germans, and we would give them something to work on. And as they work on that term project, they would deal with time zone differences, cultural differences, institutional differences. So thereby experiencing in real life what I'm trying to convey through my lectures. And to my surprise, when I sent out an email through the Academy of International Business asking if anyone wants to participate in a project like that. So I think the first time, so I got about 15 or so emails within a few hours, but the first time we had 7 universities, 7 countries participating in the project, and then it's been growing since then. So for example, this semester we have about 6,000 students from about 157 universities in about 71 countries. And so that's by the location of the students. But also, if you look at the nationalities, it's just about every possible nationality in this project in any given semester. So when I say we will give them an international experience, that's each team will be comprised or is comprised of about 6 students, each one from a different country. Often everyone is on a different continent. We've never had Antarctica. I'm still hoping. We've had teams from neutral waters, like we've had teams of students who would take a class where they take international business courses while also working on a cruise ship. So it was like an interesting combination for one university where they would, it's like learn and work, or work and learn. And so it's a professor with the students on the cruise ship sailing somewhere between, I don't know, somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. And they have classes, but they also work while there. So we even had participants from a location that is, changing every day. So, but in any case, very international. And so originally the plan was that the students would complete some sort of a case study, but then shortly after, one of our professors was doing a consulting project for Mercedes-Benz. And so they thought it would be a good idea to ask our students for some ideas for a marketing strategy for their buses and trucks in Africa. They reached out to me. I thought it was a good idea. The students did a very good job. In fact, the company was so happy that they even invited 37 of the students to visit their factory in Istanbul, Turkey, where they have a full cycle factory. So we saw how they make those buses and trucks from literally like a roll of metal to where they would give you the key, you put it in the ignition, turn the key, and the whole engine starts for the first time. So very interesting experience. But so one big change that happened since 2013 is that it's real companies that come to us with real challenges. So this semester we have 13 such companies. Some are big, like Alibaba. We've had some, as I said, Mercedes-Benz, the Home Depot, Louis Vuitton, but also some, and most of them are medium-sized companies and any kind of industry, and then also even some startups these days. So food, clothing, services, IT, banking, you name it. And so normally each company represents a different industry and is headquartered in a different country. And then the teams can choose whichever one they want, whichever one they think they will help. And usually it's more or less evenly spread. So each client company gets about 100 teams or so working on the challenge. For the students, the good thing is that it's a real challenge from a real company. And in many cases, the incentives are quite high because in the end, not only do they get a certificate from us, a recommendation letter from us, but also the best students are invited to our semi-annual X-Culture Global Business Week Symposium. So the next one will be in Finland. The last one was in Thailand. Before that, we had Italy, Canada, the United States, and so on. And so many of them get travel stipends either from us or from the universities. So in a way, money is involved. But also many companies offer aftermarket commission, and almost all companies use it also as a selection tool. So some specifically say we will hire this many people and the best ones will get jobs. Some say it will be an internship, and some say, well, we'll see what you do, but if you do well, you may even get a job offer. And we always have some that end up hiring our students. As one of the company CEOs said a long time ago, he says it's the best way to hire, because unlike the traditional way where you see a recommendation letter, maybe a cover letter, and maybe a CV, and maybe a 30-minute interview, here we observe performance for essentially a whole semester. You look at the quality of the work, but also you have peer evaluations, you have some sort of measures of diligence and timeliness, but even the fact that the company or the team or the student chose your company as a client, that's already important. And in many cases, they also ask to do some surveys, maybe like talk to 5 potential distributors or retailers or customers. So again, it shows that students are not only motivated enough, but comfortable enough to conduct that kind of research interviews. So it's definitely more of a job sample than a traditional method that relies on a copy of CV and maybe interview. So for students, it's high stakes. And so when it comes to whether or not these are sort of real work groups, not quite, but it's very, very close to the real thing. So it goes on for the whole semester. So it's not a quick simulation in the classroom. The cultural, time zone, geographic dispersion, if you want to study virtual teams, as real as it gets, not simulated, it's real, different cultures, different time zones. Incentives, not quite the same when you do it as part of your sort of, for salary job, but it's definitely much more than a little bonus or a little grade in the course. For many students, in fact, for my students this semester, this is the course. So we have a Master's of Science in International Business, that 100% of the grade depends on their performance in the project. So the stakes are pretty high. But also because if you do well, you can get internship offers, job offers, stipend, travel stipends, invited to the symposium. Again, it's definitely stakes are high enough where it's not just, for fun. So definitely students are trying to do it well. But also, and that's very important, we have 1,000 teams every semester. And so the trade-off here is, well, one real team or 1,000 almost real teams. So that's one trade-off. But also if the concern is age or sort of maturation effect, so to speak, or work experience, we sort of got that covered. Well, first, about half of the participants are MBA and EMBA students. So those are not all kids, teenagers. So a good half are in their 20s, 30s, and we even have always people in their 40s, 50s, and even 60s. Some people go back to school later, some people decide to do a degree later. So even if many of them or most of them are students, almost all of them do have work experience. About a third have jobs now, about a third have managerial experience. But importantly, very importantly, there is enough variation on any of those dimensions in the sample that you can have that as a covariate. If you think that age matters, well, just control for age. We have age from 18 to literally 65. If you think that work experience matters, again, you have enough. You can even extract a subsample where everybody has 10 plus years of experience, or you can have that as a control or a covariate. And so, yes, these will not be all professional consultants or employees, but you have enough variation in the sample where you can control for those things, account for those things, or select a smaller sample where that is the case. And so you can look at it. So compare EMBA teams to undergraduate teams. If there is a difference, well, you know in which direction the bias might be, or just use only EMBA teams for your study. So plus, again, if you look at, like if you wanted to use this sample to study maybe some attitudes towards, I don't know, politics, yes, those things change over time. As the famous saying goes, if you are not liberal when you are a teenager, and if you're not conservative when you are like a mid-age person, then there is something wrong with you. So those things change. But if you wanted to know, for example, how time zones affect communication in global virtual teams, there is really no reason to believe that our teams would face challenges that are different that are faced by employees and organizations. Not to mention that these people, they will graduate within a year or two at most, and so they will be. So again, it's not really like a decade separated from the real job, so to speak. So, but then also in addition, we do not only can, but we do conduct weekly surveys, and so much of the data are collected weekly, like peer evaluations are done weekly, conflicts, communication, leadership, just about everything that's going on in the team. All of that is measured at 10 different time points throughout the project, before, after, and each week. We can conduct additional data collection, like, we measure almost always personality, CQ, EQ, IQ, cultural values, you name it, like all kinds of attitudes and behaviors. But also we can do experiments, and we've done quite a few. So we've had, tested effects of monetary prizes for the winners. We've tested effects of a discussion board where teams that sort of compete against one another can also collaborate. We've tested, team size, team composition, communication channel. All of those things are within our control, and we can make some changes and differences in the correspondence that goes to the students or what they are allowed or told to do. Like, for example, we just completed a project where we looked at the effects of AI feedback on team performance. And so we had some teams that were getting no feedback, some teams that were getting feedback from professors, and some teams that were getting feedback from AI. So, things like that. So we can embed that in the design of the project, something that would be very, very difficult to do with real work teams. But then also equally importantly, it doesn't have to be teams. So strangely enough, if you look at my resume, I've published papers in journals on, like for example, robotics journals, like literally. So we had robotics, we had marketing and things like that. So the way I ended up being a co-author of a few studies on robots, like literally not just IT, but literally robots. So we had some team of people who wanted to study differences in attitudes towards machines, robots in your homes. And so they created videos of different robots. Some of them look like Wall-E, like a cute, nice one. Some of them looked like all these Optimus, whatever it's called, the Tesla robot or Boston Dynamics. And some looked more like Terminators. And so they wanted to see if people would be comfortable with having those machines in their homes, but they wanted to see if there is a difference by personality, by values, but also by geography, by country. And so XCulture, yeah, I guess it's a little bit not international business, but we could ask students, would you take a robot like that, as your assistant at home? And so we could, show different videos to different people and can see that, some cultures are more accepting of the machines in their homes and houses, and some are not. So it's, it's not like we designed the robots, but it was, a robotics type of research. Likewise, we've done a lot of strategy research. So for example, one dissertation recently defended, the PhD student wanted to know if your personal biases affect your business strategic decisions. And so the way the study was designed was we asked people before they even placed on teams and before they even know who the client is, what countries they like. So they were presented with a list of countries and they had to tell us, which countries they sort of find cool. So like, for example, Switzerland or Sweden tended to be, ranked high, like Saudi Arabia or United Arab Emirates, even though they're equally developed economically, they tended to be a little bit lesser popular and things like that. And then the students said, okay, well, let's forget about that. But then they looked at which new markets that teams recommended to their clients. And sure enough, there was a correlation between your personal sort of opinion of the country or how much you like the country, and then which country you recommend your client expands into, which technically should be unrelated. Maybe there are opportunities, I don't know, in Sierra Leone or Ukraine or whatever other country. But so there are some of those biases in strategic decisions. Or we also have done some marketing research where, for example, again, another PhD student recently defended. So she wanted to know if the country image affects purchasing decisions. And so again, we had some videos, printed ads for, it was cosmetics and clothing, electronics and cosmetics. And identical ads, but in some it was said that the country of origin is China, and in some that it was Italy. And so we just wanted to see, and before that she also surveyed how students perceive images of these different countries. And so she was able to show that the country image sort of spills over and affects our perception of the quality of the product itself. So identical product, identical price, everything's the same. But if you think the country has a positive image, you automatically assume that the product is also good, and the other way around. So those are some of the examples. And just 2 more minutes, and then we can go more into the data and other things. So a few other developments happened around the XCulture project that were sort of not originally planned, but have happened and now have become also a research opportunity. So, well, originally we didn't even collect the data the first time when we did it, other than the peer evaluations and report evaluations, just because we needed it for grading. But then we needed to know for administrative needs, why some teams struggle and others do well, why some people are more likely to get high peer evaluations and others don't, why some people are more likely to be team leaders or not, or do we need to require that teams elect a leader, or maybe it's better to have no leader or leave it up to the team. So some of those data collections happened just because we needed it for administrative purposes, but then we started adding more and more things. But also some developments happened just because, like, for example, now we have a group of people we call coaches. So it's about 100 people each semester. So they help us run the project. They essentially serve as coaches or mentors or advisors or, you name it. But the way that came about was that we had some students who wanted to participate in XCulture again and again and again. And when we had one person who did it 4 times in a row, he just says, can I please do it again just for fun? I'm like, okay. And then again. And then when he said for the 4th time, I really like it, can I do it one more time? I thought, well, instead of you, Heinrich was his name, instead of you doing it as a team member, maybe you can be a coach. And then I thought, well, if he will be a coach, let me see if anyone else did it a couple times. And we found a few people. The first time I think we had like 10 people or something. But then we kind of turned it slowly into a full-fledged coaching program. So those people need to apply. They need to complete 16 training modules on things like how to provide feedback, how to resolve conflicts, how to organize training webinars, things like that. And only those who pass, usually we have about 400 or 500 who apply, and then we select about 100 who actually then become the coaches. So for them, it's a great experience because now they are not just members of global virtual teams, but they are essentially managers or at least mentors and coaches. They provide feedback. They, do all like help us run all kinds of training programs. So very good for their resume. But also that's an interesting research opportunity, both effective coaching on teams, what works, what doesn't. We do a lot of studies here, like what kind of feedback improves performance, what kind of conflict resolution leads to more satisfaction, things like that. But also they are also essentially a work group. So it's almost 100 people working very closely, helping us run the project. So it's more like an administrative team. So that's interesting. Then we noticed that many of our professors were bringing students to conferences with them, Academy of International Business. And at some point, instead of just bringing them, we started organizing like a segment, a couple of sessions for the students, career development, things like that. And then at some point it became institutionalized. And so we would have a whole segment of X-Culture at the Academy of International Business conference. But then so many students wanted to attend this conference that AAB said, if you bring all of them, it will become basically a student gathering. So we started organizing separate, what we call the Business Week Symposium. So, and as I said, we did the first one in 2016 and have been doing it every year since then. And so that's 150 students. They work a little bit online beforehand, but then they spend the whole week. So there are usually 4 client companies. We visit the companies, we meet with the CEOs, they prepare. So there is a challenge that they work on, they prepare the presentations, they present. But here it's an interesting combination. So it's still a large number of teams. So it's usually still about 30 teams or so. But then in addition, they actually work face-to-face for the whole week. So that's an interesting, again, research opportunity. And they're right there. You can observe them. You can, you can get really deep with the data collection, again, teams or strategy or whatnot. So that's an interesting, again, a development, but also a research opportunity. And then research hackathons. So we started getting together from time to time, with our professors to do some sort of paper development. And at some point, we've done about 20 of those. It's become essentially an institutionalized. We do 2 of those at least every year, and sometimes 3, usually right before the Academy of Management. So we did one in Chicago last year, then before that Seattle, Boston, and this time it will be in Copenhagen. So what we do is we normally book at the dormitories of a university that is nearby. In Copenhagen, it will be hotels for the first time because there is no dorm available in the area where AUM is. But in Chicago, it was Loyola University at Chicago, just because it's right where the conference was. And so we just book usually for about 9 nights. So it would be like 4 or 5 days before the conference and then the conference. So dorms are cheaper. We usually get breakfast with the dorm, and it's more fun. So we kind of professors and usually some PhD students as well. But it's nice to live in a dorm for another week. And then, we work from early in the morning till late at night, but then have some fun. Like in Chicago, we went on a sailboat, evening. But then also we would have like karaoke sometimes and things like that, because the dorms are empty in the summer anyway. So it's basically all to ourselves. But the way we organize those, again, so we get together, usually we aim for 12 people, but somehow always end up closer to 20. But then, day one, we brainstorm research ideas, select the most promising ones, form the research teams. And then from early in the morning till late at night, each team works on the project, presents every few hours to the rest of the group, gets feedback, criticism, works for a few more hours, presents, get criticism. And so usually in that week or so, we can go from the idea, not quite to a finished paper, but enough, at least fully developed a research design. Who is who the co-authors are, who does what. In many cases, you already started running some analyses. Like in many cases, you would even have some preliminary results. You start looking at the literature to make sure that you know what your theory is and what's been done. And so again, these are extremely popular among the PhD students because you need to move quickly. Like professors, we have time, so to speak. you really don't have much time. And so here, in a matter of a week, you can fully develop your study, you can get useful, valuable feedback, you can get access to the data, and it doesn't have to be only XCulture data. In many cases, it's something around other data. So a lot of fun, but also extremely productive. So some of those developments have been happening, as I said, more in response to demand, or something that we kind of started doing, it just becomes more organized. Like now with these hackathons, like we would have the t-shirts and we would have a formal program and everything. And so we always have some people who participate every year, some new people, some people who have nothing to do with XCulture. In fact, we deliberately try to have some external participants so that we have some fresh ideas and so on. So that's basically how it's done. But yeah, that's briefly about what we do. And so yes, the data we collect, huge gigantic data set. It's over 3,000 variables, almost 4,000 variables that we've measured over time, some of them every semester and some only when needed. It's multi-level, so you have individual, team, university, country, longitudinal, so many things are measured up to 10 times in a row, multi-source, so self-reports, peer evaluations, client evaluations or feedback, professor evaluations, administrative records, qualitative, quantitative, administrative stuff, and things like that. And my interest here is that I'm hoping that external people like you guys can see in the data set something that I don't see or my associates don't see. One of the biggest challenges we have is that most of the professors who participate in XCulture, and it's been over 1,000 over the years, so it's about 170 or so in a given semester. Many universities have multi-person teams, so it's like 150 universities, 170 people, but almost all of them teach international business, international marketing. And so the challenge here is that most sort of come from the same discipline and have the same research ideas. So like every semester somebody says, hey, let's see if cultural intelligence predicts performance in virtual teams. That's sort of all. So it's the external people who come from somewhat different disciplines and backgrounds. So often they have ideas that I would have never had myself. So some of the most interesting ideas actually came from people completely from outside of the business discipline. So we've had some interesting studies from sociologists, psychologists, economists, key people. So that's where my hope is. And so, yeah, in terms of what we measure, just about anything and everything related to background, nationality, prior international experience, age, work experience, things like that. Just about every type of attitude, as I said, values, personality, like all kinds of major constructs. Everything related to what's going on in the team, leadership, communication, conflicts, team stage developments, just about everything. Performance, every possible way, individual performance, team performance, like if there is an instrument out there, we probably used it at some point. And then also a lot of experiments, like let's manipulate team size, communication channel, duration of this, structure, use of AI, no use of AI, use of camera, no camera, things like that. And so much of the data is available, and I would be very, very happy to share it with you or anyone else who has a good research idea. But also we collect data every semester. So if an interesting idea is presented, if it's promising, if it looks like it can lead to something, we will be very happy to collect the data for you. So we get quite a few requests for data collection, but to be honest, many of them are either repetitive or, I don't want to say not good, but we know that it probably will not lead to a publication in a top journal. So it's easy to say no to those. Some requests are also just simply not good requests for us. Like, for example, some of the recent ones from actually Ivy League schools. Somebody wanted us to ask each student to install an app that will track their sleeping patterns. So they wanted to see how your sleep affects your performance. Interesting, promising, but a little too much to ask and probably a little too distal from what we do. It will be hard to sell and to require that all students install the app. And another one wanted the students to track what they eat. So again, interesting. I guess your diet affects your mood and performance, but again, a little too much. And sometimes it would be also like somebody would approach me and says, hey, can you include this little survey? So it's only like 187 questions and we need to do it every week. Here, it's not even that I, don't want students to spend too much time on it or they will rebel. It's more at some point people just get tired and it's garbage in, garbage out. So you have to be like if it's more than 15 minutes for the whole thing, probably they will stop reading and just randomly click on the answers, and you get a lot of data, but not very useful data. And so our constraint is that we still need to collect some data for the administrative purposes, like peer evaluations. So there is room for maybe like 1 or 2 questionnaires in addition to what we need to measure anyway. Experiments are easier, so those are not leading to more questions usually, but surveys, we have to be careful about how much we pack and sort of dump onto the students in terms of, how many questions they need to answer. But anyway, I'll stop here. I'm curious if you have any comments, observations, questions, suggestions maybe, and so maybe we can converse.
Okay, thanks, Vas. Does anybody have any questions?
No questions usually means what? Either everything is clear, you covered it all in 35 minutes. I have no idea what he just talked about. Nothing's clear. So I hope it's the first kind.
I heard somebody say, can you repeat that?
Yeah.
Vas, let me ask you, if nobody else has a question, let me ask you a quick question about the cultural values that you measure. I think you said you had something like 3,000 or 4,000 total variables, not necessarily collected every semester. But which of the cultural values do you tend to collect data on, let's say every year, at least once a year?
I actually have even more than that to your very good question. So when it comes to cultural values, that happens to be sort of my specialty. And so one of the things I've done, and even I would say known for, I collect cultural value measurement instruments. So I have this catalog of like 155, I believe at this time, cultural value instruments. And so I've actually written some papers separate of X-Culture simply on reviewing how culture has been measured over the last half a century. Another paper, by the way, and also a collection of instruments, cultural intelligence instruments. So, but in any case, for a while, we've tried just about every instrument that is good. So we've tried Hofstadter, obviously different versions, Schwartz Value Survey, Dorfman and Howell, UYOO. So we've tried at least a dozen or so. But then over time, we also developed a couple of our own instruments. And just last year, we published a paper in the Journal of World Business where we compared the 8 most popular instruments in terms of all kinds of things, psychometric properties, internal reliability, predictive validity, and things like that. And so we did that as well. So, but we normally would use, well, now we use our own because it's legitimately the best one. And it's not because I say so, but because it was developed after studying closely all the other good instruments and fixing problems they had. So it was almost a cheating game because we tested multiple instruments, figured out which ones are good, but then looked at what else is missing there. And so we developed this one to be essentially the best. And yes, it has the best internal reliability. The vector structure is very clean, best predictive validity and things like that. And usually now that's the one that we use every single semester. And it's the same story, by the way, with the cultural intelligence instrument. So we use Ann et al. It's a very good instrument, but we also have our own that solves some of the problems that Ann et al.'s instrument still has, particularly self-assessment, self-report component, which is always somewhat a problem in this kind of data collection.
I have a question. My name is Blakely. Nice to meet you. Thanks for being here today, so to speak. Just curious, so I guess these teams, like one way to look at this is that they deliver potential opportunities and ideas to these companies beyond simply the selection process. So like, obviously that's indication of like quality of ideas or opportunities. Are there other measures of idea quality or opportunity quality beyond simply the selection of those ideas?
A very, very good question. And to be honest, there is no easy solution. I know what you're talking about in terms of how do you measure quality. And normally another question that comes up in this context is creativity or novelty of the idea. And so we've been struggling with this in multiple ways, so to speak. Well, one, yes, the client reads the report and I like this one, I don't like that one. And so what we actually do is normally it's about 5 to 6 different people who rate every single report. So you have like 6 judges or so on average, and so then you can take the average as well. So this way, hopefully it's a little bit more reliable. But so ideally, obviously, so most of the time the challenge is of this kind. Not always, but most of the time. So the company would be like, for example, a company that is specifically hiring this year. It's called Advanced Super Abrasives. It's actually out of North Carolina here. So they make grinding stones and drill bits. In fact, the Mars rover that is searching for life on Mars now. So they have some tools on that machine that were made here in North Carolina by this company, Advanced Super Abrasives. So it's the kind of grindstones and drill bits that you wouldn't buy at the Home Depot. That's, like, for example, they make the polishing stones for hypodermic needles, like very, very fine stuff. But anyway, so they are a very typical company that says, we make this product. We kind of have the US market more or less covered. So we sell in the US, we know how to do it, but we think there is a market for our product beyond the United States. So your job is to conduct competition analysis. Who else on this planet makes products like this? Our strength, weaknesses compared to the competition. Then you think about which other markets would be suitable for us, where the clients potentially could be and where the competition is low. Then once you identify this market, do research into certification requirements, international trade requirements, tariffs, all kinds of forms and things like that. Develop a strategy for shipping and logistics management. Would we use some sort of an exporter? Do we do it ourselves? Develop the strategy for the market entry mode. Should we sell it directly to the consumer? Should we have a distributor, retailers, joint venture, things like that? What would be the best marketing campaign? Again, in some cases, it's a product that you would advertise on, for example, social media or TV. For a product like these, advanced tools, that's probably going to be more like professional trade fairs or maybe newsletters or maybe magazines and things like that, all the way to pricing strategy and sometimes even like if it's a smaller company, like financing or raising funds and things like that. And often it would be like, for example, in this case, they want specifically, we call it a real test. So they say, okay, well, if you believe that Germany is a suitable market, so why don't you talk to potential buyers? Ask them where they buy their products, how they identify the suppliers, do they know anything about Advanced Super Abrasives, but also ask them what would it take for them to take a look at our product, would they buy it, why or why not, and things like that. And then if you bring it to us and show that, well, this company, whatever, XYB is interested in our product, that's, yes, probably there is a market there. And the other way around, if nobody says yes, well, maybe you're wrong. So in a way, to properly test this strategy, you would need to ask the client to implement them and see if they work. And it's probably unrealistic. So we have to go basically by the judgment of the quality of the proposal from the professors and the clients as they look at them. And some of those things are very hard to define. So we measure all kinds of things like, for example, formatting quality, that's easy. Like how thorough the arguments are, presentation, that's easy. But when it comes to economic viability and creativity, those are very difficult to define, let alone, to measure. Like, for example, creativity and novelty of the idea, like what would even constitute that? A lot of studies or professors would like to do a study on creativity, but like in a case that I told you, let's say the team recommends that Germany is the new best market. Well, is it novel, creative? Like, would the United States be not novel and Germany is novel or creative? If they say advertise through newsletter versus advertise at professional trade fairs or advertise at, social media, like which of those is more novel and creative? Like very, very difficult. Pricing strategy, again, some of these things are, like I wouldn't even know what constitutes novelty and creativity. And then obviously economic viability and quality, unless you really put it to a test, and that test may take years and you have a control group, I don't think there is an easy way to determine, how economically viable it is. So some of those things, I'm afraid, within practical means, like even if you could run the experiments, economic conditions, all kinds of other factors can affect the outcome. So maybe it was not a bad idea. Maybe the implementation was bad. So therefore, we do the best we can. So as I said, multiple people evaluate every possible aspect of those proposals, from the idea itself to the way it was presented. But that's definitely not enough. And at the same time, I don't really think there is a way to do it any better way, so to speak, unless you have some ideas or suggestions, because it's a constant struggle for us.
Well, so being in entrepreneurship, to me, I would argue that is enough, because, the economic viability, you never know that up front. That's a future finding. So entrepreneurs never know if it's going to work out. So that's not necessarily a factor on the quality of the opportunity itself, because all these students are doing essentially are identifying opportunities for the companies. What those companies do with the opportunities, that's up to them, and that's up to the future and a lot of luck and everything else. So there is a stream within entrepreneurship, though, where we talk about like how do entrepreneurs create or identify opportunities, and there's lots of stuff that goes into there. You know, a lot of the similar works comes out of economics in terms of like entrepreneurial alertness, like what makes some people more alert to certain opportunities versus others. So that's kind of where my mind was going when you're talking about this data set, is you have all these background characteristics of the students and of the teams. And so to kind of tease out like, okay, what qualities of these teams perhaps are related to producing these higher quality opportunities to the companies, thus the ones that the companies select. So simply by identifying Germany as a better market, right, than the US, who cares? You're right, who cares if that's creative? It's probably not. But we can say with pretty decent certainty, I think, in that setting anyway, that that's the better or higher quality opportunity that's being identified for whatever reason. But the question is, why did that team or those teams identify that, whereas 500 other teams did not?
Yeah. And again, so yes, exactly. We can look into why, and that would be a good study. So I told you that we looked before, for example, in terms of the market selection, personal biases, but it could be something else. One thing I would like to add in this context, also this whole idea of measuring the quality of consulting in general, but also sort of the Encyclopedia Britannica versus Wikipedia style, or in our case, crowdsourcing versus professional consultants. So we do a lot of experiments and research into how to lead teams to the best possible proposals. But one question always remains, is the company better off hiring, let's say, McKinsey or Deloitte or Boston Consulting Group versus hiring a crowd of amateurs like XCulture Global Crowd? And so again, one study that I actually want to do is to hire one of those professional companies to work on the same challenge. And then we have a crowd and we have this multi-stage selection. And in the end, this is the best that the crowd could produce, and this is the best that McKinsey produced. And then you have two reports without the title page. You show it to the client and you ask which one you like more. And so if they select ours, great. But even if they say, well, both are good, or, well, there is a big difference in price and so on. So, but in any case, one thing I've been thinking about where these crowdsourced, sort of platforms can be suitable and useful when it comes to consulting. So there are some places or some things where you don't need a crowd. Like, for example, if you need to tie your shoe, you don't need a crowd. Or if you want to design a nuclear reactor, you probably want a few professional nuclear physicists, not a large crowd, But some tasks are uniquely suitable for crowdsourcing. Like, for example, with XCulture, so some value comes from the sort of volume. Like, as one of the CEOs said, XCulture, it's like sending millions of ants in all directions to look for a candy that somebody dropped. So if somebody dropped a candy, someone will stumble upon it. So here you have a lot of ideas. Most of them are bad, but someone serendipitously happens to either know something or just once in a lifetime came up with a good idea, or maybe read something, or so how it's done. So here you dismiss 99%, but that one idea in that pile is actually extremely, extremely useful. Likewise, if you say, well, tell me who my competition, are. Again, each team will find maybe one or two or five companies, but when you get it from hundreds of teams, you actually have a pretty good global survey of everyone who works in your space. Or if part of the task is, talk to 5 potential customers and ask them, what would it take for them to buy our product? Again, each team surveys maybe 5, 10 potential customers, but again, you put it together and you have thousands of responses globally. And again, if you wanted to hire, McKinsey or a professional consulting company to do that, not only it will be extremely costly, but the question also is, will they have access to all of these respondents in all of these countries? So, but also there is some value in sort of averaging the effects. It's like, on Who Wants to Be the Millionaire. So the ask the audience is correct about 92% of the time. Call a friend, call an expert is correct only like 70% of the time. And with the audience, it's not that audience is smart, it's just the most popular answer tends to be the correct one, even if it only got like by 1% more than the second popular answer. So here, if you ask me, for example, what is the best market? Well, if I tell you it's Germany, it's not of much value to you. But if you had 200 teams working on your challenge, they did surveys, research, analysis, and 180 of those teams say that Germany is the best market, it probably means something. Likewise, you ask, so what should be the price for this pen? If I tell you, $1.50, well, it's useful, but not much. But again, if hundreds of teams try to determine the best price for this pen for this market, and you see the distribution and it seems to center around $1.50, that's actually useful. So that could be, so some of these things, as I said, these crowds, they serve almost like a big focus group, like we call it global expertise locally. So some of these are serendipitous things, some of those are just, you pull together small bits of contributions and you get a big contribution. So essentially like Wikipedia versus the Encyclopedia Britannica. And again, I'm not sure if you can reliably measure the quality of those contributions and their economic viability, but some of them are really, really useful. Like, for example, if you ask to conduct a survey of potential clients, it's not so much about, right and wrong. It's, you ask the questions, you got it from dozens of countries, from thousands of people. So that's good, it's not that it's right or wrong. That's, you see the survey. So that's very valuable right there. Or for example, if you do ask, give me the full list of our, competitors. Again, once you compile it all, again, it is good. It may not be fully comprehensive, but so some of those you can actually measure the quality right there just simply by the volume or by consistency across teams or averages and things like that.
Question. In developing your own measures, can you give a few examples of what was wrong with or missing from existing measures that you collected?
Yes, so we've developed quite a few. And again, I'll try to answer it a little bit more broadly and then give a couple of specific examples. So some or constant struggle is, do we use an existing scale or do we develop our own scale? And so there is a gigantic bias in our field towards so-called published validated scales. And if it's published, presumably it's good. And if it's not, presumably it's not good. And so often we would submit a paper to a journal using an unpublished scale, and the reviewers are not happy with that. And many people who request data collection, they say, well, I want this scale to be used for the reason that it's published, validated, and I don't want to fight with the reviewers about it. And so sometimes they're not necessarily good scales, like we see some problems with them right there. So some questions make no sense. Like, sometimes you can spot right away that it's not the best, one. Another challenge, again, as I said, the length. And sometimes you don't need the length. Like, if it's a 20-item scale to measure if the team had a conflict, as I say, sometimes you don't need to have a scale. Sometimes it's enough to ask one direct question. Like if I wanted to know how old you are, I can just simply ask, how old are you? So I don't need to have a 20-item, survey instrument to measure your age. I guess I could, but it's probably unnecessary. And so one of the struggles always is that I say, well, why not just ask directly? And then the person who requests data collection says, well, reviewers will not like it. And, everyone seems to accept this scale, so let's use it. In terms of reasons and instances when we had to develop our own, cultural intelligence is a good example. We actually developed two of them. One is already published and the other one, I haven't published it yet. But so the first one was developed, we called it BCIQ, so business sort of IQ, business cultural IQ. The reason for that was that the most popular one, and it all, but also quite a few other ones, they were developed more by sort of psychology professors, education professors, and the questions were more like academic context. And so if you wanted to apply it in business context, the question just didn't make much sense. So we kind of used the same approach, just rephrased the questions to be more applicable if you wanted to measure it like in the context of expatriation or employees. The second one that we developed, it was an attempt to deal with the self-report, self-assessment bias. Like the most popular instrument, and at all, 2008, I'll give you a question, and in fact, if I may ask you, and maybe all of you even. So the item is phrased like this. So on a 5-point scale from 1 to 5, how would you rate your agreement with the statement, I know about cultures and traditions of other countries? What would you give to yourself? Well, whatever number you put in your mind. So, well, one, obviously, it's a problematic item because you can clearly manipulate Like if you're applying for a job and they measure cultural intelligence, you sort of know what answer they're looking for. Like if I was measuring your IQ, I would ask you a question. It wouldn't be this question, but the question would be like, for example, what is 2 + 2? And you either know the answer or you don't. When it comes to IQ, that's how it's measured. But when it comes to CQ, cultural intelligence, the items would be framed as on a scale from 1 to 5. How well do you think you know the answer to the question 2 + 2? And you would say, well, I think I know, very well or somewhat well. So that's problematic. But second, even if you are trying to be as honest as it gets, like for example, if I ask myself that question, I don't know, I know a lot about other cultures, so I can give myself a 5 out of 5. But I also know that I don't know everything, so maybe 4 out of 5 will be more appropriate. Well, I know that I don't know much about some cultures at all, and in fact, I know how little I know because I studied that. So I could justify for myself anything between like 2 and 5 on that scale. And so here, that's a challenge. And so we developed a scale that I call quasi-observational. So instead of asking questions like, again, like exact wording from Anne et al., I seek contact with people from other cultures, or I enjoy interacting with people from other cultures. Well, in our scale, it's almost the same questions, but it starts with a priming question. So like the last time when you traveled overseas, which country did you go to? Why did you go there? So like you remember a specific trip. Or if you haven't been overseas, the other version, so last time you interacted with people from other countries in your country. So think about that instance. And then the question would be, well, how many people, locals, did you talk to? Or for example, I know about cultures of other countries. Well, based on that trip, how much can you say about their culture? And so the answers are, like, for example, did you interact with locals on that trip? No, I didn't have time to. Well, maybe 1, 2, or 3, more than 5. Or, well, I can't really say much about the culture. Well, I can say a few sentences, a few observations. I can probably write up like a short essay. I can write a whole book. And so here, at least it gives you some quasi-observation. You recall a specific trip. And I think in the actual question, it says the last 3 trips, what would be the average? But also it gives you some quasi-objective way to measure. So like, for example, my last trip was, where was I last? London a few weeks ago. So I actually know that I wrote a Facebook post with like 25 things that struck me when I was in London. The last time I was there was like 20 years ago. So at least I know how much new stuff I observed about the British culture in London in particular. I know that I spoke to 2 locals, so I actually specifically sought out that contact. So at least I will be able to more or less objectively assess my whatever dimensions you're trying to measure. So it's also not perfect, but that was one of the refinements that we made specifically when it comes to cultural intelligence, just to give you an example. So with cultural values, it was similar, but again, we were not happy with Hofstede as well. Hofstede's instrument is just bad to begin with, like it was a bad instrument. But second, it had problems like, for example, individualism, collectivism, so that you probably have heard. If it were up to me, I would ban that term in our field altogether because it lost its meaning. Like it can mean anything and everything from my interest versus group interest, family versus work, preference to work in teams, preference to work individually, all the way to like basically East and West. So we tried to, separate that dimension into a few things that are more specific, and then also came up with a few additional dimensions that are not captured by Hofstede just to make sure that it's all good. And then in addition, also refine the questions themselves. So I think Frank left, so we are out of time, right? So, yeah. So I'll conclude with this. So I guess if you have additional questions, or if you think these data may be useful for you, or if you would like data collected in an international context, team-based or international otherwise, you know how to find me. I'm very open to collaboration, to sharing existing data or collecting new data. And then if you have any suggestions or recommendations for how to run this sort of crowdsourced consulting data collection research project, very, very interested in this sort of policy applications or administration of the project. And yeah, so we can stop here, but I hope at least with some of you, the conversation will continue, and I hope it will be mutually beneficial. All right. Okay, well, thank you. Thank you, everyone. So stay in touch, and I hope to hear at least from some of you. Bye-bye.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Actually, we're touched with these.
You're gonna close this.
All this.
Okay.